The first time they laughed at her, she did not turn around. The sound carried across the frozen fields, sharp and thin like the wind that scraped over the hills. A few men stood by the general store porch, boots planted in the snow, hands wrapped around tin cups of coffee gone cold. They pointed toward the far edge of town where her little patch of land met the woods. From there, you could see it plain as day, a crooked barn shelter leaning against a weather-beaten farmhouse, patched together with old boards and stubborn pride. Folks said it looked like a child had built it. They said it would never last a proper winter. They said she was wasting her time. For 2 years they said a lot of things. She heard every word. The old woman kept her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders as she crossed the yard, boots crunching over frost that had hardened like iron. Her house sat low against the wind, gray boards worn smooth by seasons of rain and snow. The barn shelter clung to its side, small and narrow, with a slanted roof that dipped just enough to push water and snow away from the stacked firewood inside. It was not pretty. It was not grand. But it stood. She had built it herself. That alone had been enough to stir the town. In that corner of America, where barns were raised by crews of men and advice came free whether you wanted it or not, a widow hammering nails alone was something to talk about. She had started with scraps, old fence posts, leftover planks from a neighbor's shed. Bent nails she straightened by hand on a flat stone. Every afternoon she worked until her fingers went stiff and her back ached. When the first spring rain came, she stayed out there, testing the slope of the roof, watching how the water slid off. By summer, the jokes had started. They said a real woodshed needed space to breathe. They said stacking firewood that tight would trap moisture. They said she did not know the first thing about keeping wood dry. She did not argue. She did not explain that she had grown up splitting logs before sunrise. She did not remind them that she had survived more winters than some of them had years to their names. She just kept stacking. Each piece of firewood was placed with care. Bark side up, cut ends turned inward. The bottom layer lifted off the ground on thick rails so no meltwater could seep in. She left a narrow gap at the back for air to pass through, though from the road it looked sealed tight. The door was simple but heavy, reinforced with a diagonal brace to hold it square. When she closed it, it fit snug against the frame. In autumn, when leaves turned brittle and gold, the town gathered for the harvest fair. There were pies laid out on long tables, quilts hanging from lines, and talk of the coming cold. That year, the sky had a strange look to it. High and pale, as if already drained of warmth. Old-timers muttered about signs. The geese flew low and early. The squirrels stripped trees faster than usual. The air carried a bite that lingered even at noon. Still, when someone mentioned her barn shelter, the laughter rose again. One man said the first heavy snow would bring it down. Another said the wind would pry those boards apart like a loose tooth. They shook their heads as if the outcome were certain. She walked home alone that evening, a small sack of flour under her arm. She passed the edge of town where fields gave way to open land, and she paused for a moment to look at her place. Smoke curled thin from the chimney. The barn shelter stood in shadow, quiet and plain. She felt no need to defend it. The first winter after she built it was mild. Snow came late and left early. The men at the store shrugged and said she had been lucky. Anyone's wood would have stayed dry that year. She said nothing, though she knew luck had little to do with it. The second winter tested her more. Ice storms came in January, coating trees in glass. The roads froze over so hard wagon wheels skidded sideways. One morning she found the well rope stiff as a rod, but even then the cold broke after a few weeks. The town endured, and when spring thawed the fields, the teasing returned. They said she had escaped by chance again. She spent that summer making small changes. She added a wider overhang to the roof, using boards she traded for with jars of preserved beans. She sealed the gaps between planks with strips of old cloth dipped in pine resin. She reinforced the back wall where drifting snow had piled highest. Every improvement was quiet, careful. Some folks watched from a distance. A few shook their heads. No one offered help. By the time the third autumn rolled in, the air felt different. Even the birds seemed restless. The sky carried a weight that pressed down on the land. Frost came early, clinging to the ground long after sunrise. Crops came in thin and hurried. The talk at the store turned serious. They began to say words like record-breaking. They spoke of storms rolling in from the north, gathering strength over frozen lakes. They warned each other to stack extra firewood. That was when the same men who had mocked her barn shelter walked past her place more slowly than usual. They eyed the narrow structure, the tight door, the careful stack inside. One of them muttered that she ought to bring the wood indoors before real weather hit. She was in the yard when he said it. She looked up from splitting a final round of oak. Her face was lined deep from years in sun and wind, but her eyes were steady. "It will hold," she said simply. He laughed, but there was less bite in it now. The first storm arrived before Thanksgiving. Snow fell thick and fast, swallowing fences and burying paths. Wind roared down from the hills, rattling shutters and driving drifts against every wall. By morning, doors across town were half blocked by white walls of snow. Her farmhouse stood quiet beneath a heavy blanket. The barn shelter's roof bore the weight without a groan. Snow slid off its slant and piled neatly along the side, just as she had planned. Inside, her fire burned steady. She opened the shelter door that afternoon, brushing snow from its handle. The hinges creaked but held firm. The firewood inside was dry to the touch, no damp smell, no darkened ends. She carried an armful back to the stove and shut the door tight behind her. Across town, not everyone was as fortunate. Some had stacked their wood in open racks, covered only by loose tarps that flapped wild in the wind. Snow blew sideways, sneaking beneath coverings and settling deep between logs. When the temperature dropped hard that night, the moisture froze. By December, the worst had not yet come. The second storm was stronger. It tore shingles from roofs and snapped tree limbs like twigs. The road into town disappeared entirely. No wagons came, no mail arrived. The world beyond their valley might as well have vanished. She kept to her routine. Each morning, she cleared a narrow path to the barn shelter. Each evening, she brought in enough firewood to last the night. Her small kitchen glowed warm against the dark. The windows frosted over at the edges, but the room held steady heat. There were nights when the wind sounded like a living thing, howling around the corners of the house. On those nights, she would sit by the stove and listen, her hands folded in her lap. She thought of the years behind her, of all the winters she had faced with less. She thought of the voices that had doubted her. She did not feel anger, only patience. By January, the cold reached a depth no one in town could remember. Breath froze in the air before it drifted away. Wood snapped loud in the forest from the strain. Livestock huddled in barns thick with frost. And then came the third storm. It started with silence, no wind, no birds. Just a sky so pale it seemed almost white. The temperature fell through the day, dropping and dropping until even stepping outside felt dangerous. By nightfall, clouds rolled in heavy and low. Snow began again, thicker than before, driven by a wind that returned with a vengeance. Roofs groaned under the weight. Doors froze shut. The general store's porch collapsed sometime before dawn. When the storm finally passed, the town looked buried alive. Men dug tunnels from their front doors. Women shook blankets heavy with ice. Smoke rose thin from some chimneys, but not all. Word spread quickly that several woodpiles had been ruined. Snow had worked its way deep inside, melting and freezing again. Logs that once rang hollow now thudded dull and wet. Fires burned weak, sputtering and smoking. By afternoon, a small group made their way toward the edge of town. They moved slowly through waist-deep drifts, scarves pulled tight over their faces. They did not laugh this time. They did not point. They stopped in front of her place. The farmhouse stood as it always had, simple and steady. Smoke rose thick and sure from the chimney. The barn shelter leaned against the side, its roof still angled clean, its door closed firm against the cold. She saw them from the window before they knocked. For a long moment she stayed where she was, listening to the stove crackle behind her. She knew why they had come. She had known, in some quiet corner of her heart, that this day might arrive. The knock came again, softer this time. She rose slowly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. As she reached for the door latch, the wind picked up once more, sending a fresh gust of snow against the house. On the other side of that door stood the same men who had mocked her barn shelter for 2 years. And in the yard behind her, under a roof they had once called foolish, her firewood waited, dry and ready, through the worst winter any of them had ever seen. She lifted the latch. And then she opened the door. The wind pushed hard against the door as she opened it, and for a moment the men outside had to lean their weight forward just to keep their footing. Snow swirled around their boots and blew past her into the narrow hallway. She stepped back without a word, giving them space to enter. Their faces were red from the cold, mustaches stiff with frost. These were men who had worked the same land for decades, who had seen storms and droughts and years when the crops failed. Yet now they stood quiet, hats in their hands, eyes shifting toward the warm glow of her kitchen stove. One of them cleared his throat. He tried to sound casual, but his voice came out rough. "We were wondering," he said, "how your wood's holding up." She looked at him for a long second. Not with pride, not with anger. Just with a calm that made him drop his gaze. "It's dry," she answered. Another gust rattled the windows. Somewhere down the road, a shutter banged loose and then went silent. The men shifted their weight again, as if unsure whether to speak their real purpose out loud. The smallest among them finally did. "Some of ours didn't make it," he admitted. "Snow worked its way in, then it froze. We can't keep a good fire going." The room felt warmer suddenly, though the temperature had not changed. She stepped aside and reached for her shawl. "Come see," she said. They followed her around the side of the house, heads bent against the wind. The barn shelter stood firm, its slanted roof shedding the last of the storm's powder in a clean line. She brushed the handle free of snow and pulled the door open. Inside, the stacked firewood filled the narrow space from floor to roof. Each log lay tight against the next, bark dry and pale, no dark stains, no soft edges. A faint scent of oak drifted out, clean and sharp. One of the men reached forward and touched a piece near the front. He knocked 2 logs together. The sound rang clear, hollow and strong. He let out a low whistle. "How?" Another asked quietly. She did not answer right away. Instead, she lifted one log and handed it over. It felt light in the man's hands, not swollen with moisture, not heavy with ice. "You kept it closed tight," someone muttered. She nodded once. Tight where it needed to be. They stood there longer than they meant to, studying the simple structure they had laughed at for 2 long years. The boards were plain, some warped, some mismatched. The nails were not even lined up straight. But the angle of the roof was careful. The bottom rails kept the stack off the ground. The door shut flush against the frame. "It don't look like much," one of them said. "It wasn't meant to," she replied. Silence settled again, heavier this time. The storm had stripped away the easy jokes. What remained was something closer to need. Finally, the tallest man spoke. "Would you be willing to show us what you did? Maybe help us fix ours before the next front moves in." She studied their faces. Pride and worry mixed together in equal measure. These were the same men who had stood by the general store porch, who had called her stubborn and foolish. Yet she saw something else now too, fear, perhaps, or the weight of families waiting in cold houses. "I can show you," she said. "But I won't build it for you." They nodded quickly. That seemed fair. Inside her kitchen, they sat at the small wooden table while she poured hot water over dried leaves for tea. Steam rose between them. The stove crackled steady, fed by the very firewood they had doubted. She spread a scrap of paper on the table and smoothed it flat. With a piece of charcoal, she began to sketch the shape of the barn shelter. Simple lines, a slanted roof, a raised base. "The wind comes from the north and west," she said. "So I leaned the roof low on that side. Snow slides off before it can settle." One man frowned. "But it's near sealed up." "It looks that way," she said. "There's space in the back. Small, but enough for air to move. Not enough for snow to drift in." They listened closer now. "You stack the logs tight," another said. "Most of us leave room between." "Room is fine," she answered, "but not when the wind drives snow sideways. Tight stacks keep it from settling deep. Air still finds a way." They exchanged glances. It sounded simple when she said it, almost too simple. Outside, the sky darkened again, though it was barely afternoon. Winter had settled over the valley like a long sentence with no clear end. Rumors had already started that another storm was forming beyond the hills. One of the men leaned forward. "You were always good with wood," he said. "Even before," she paused at that. Her hands rested on the table, fingers worn and strong. "Before," she repeated softly. They all knew what that meant. Before her husband passed. Before she had to manage the farm alone. Before the fields were leased out piece by piece until only the house and small yard remained hers. In those earlier years, the farm had been known for its steady supply of seasoned firewood. Neighbors would trade for it when their own ran short. She had learned how to split, stack, and cover wood long before most of the men now sitting at her table had married. After he was gone, some assumed she would sell the place and move closer to town. Others thought she would ask for help more often. She had done neither. Instead, she built the barn shelter. One of the men cleared his throat again. "Why didn't you say something when we joked about it?" She gave a small shrug. "Would it have changed your minds?" No one answered. The truth hung between them heavier than the storm clouds outside. They had seen an old woman with a hammer and decided they knew better. They had judged the crooked boards without looking at the angles. They had mistaken quiet for ignorance. A sharp knock sounded at the door, making them all turn. Another man from town stood there, breathless, snow clinging to his coat. "The mill roof caved in," he said quickly. "And the weather report from the telegraph station says more snow by nightfall, hard freeze coming behind it." The room went still. "How hard?" someone asked. "Colder than last week." A long silence followed. The stove popped softly. The men rose from their chairs one by one. There was no more time for pride. They needed dry firewood. They needed better shelter for what they had left. She stood as well, tying her shawl tighter. "I'll come look at your sheds," she said. "We can brace what's weak and cover what's exposed. But we must move quick." They stepped back into the cold together. The wind had picked up again, cutting across the fields with a sharper edge than before. Snow from the last storm lay piled high against fences and doors. As they walked toward town, she noticed how quiet it felt. No children playing in the drifts. No idle talk by the store. Just the sound of boots pushing through snow and the distant groan of timber under strain. They stopped first at a wide-open rack stacked behind a farmhouse. A torn canvas flapped uselessly above it. She shook her head. "Too open. We need boards along the sides. Keep the wind from driving in." They worked without much talk. Hands numb, breath clouding the air. She directed them where to place planks, how to angle scrap wood to guide snow away. They followed her instructions carefully now. At the next house, the woodpile sat directly on frozen ground, already darkened at the bottom. "Raise it," she said. Even a few inches. They found old rails from a broken fence and slid them beneath the stack. It was not perfect, but it was better. As daylight faded, she felt the first hint of unease settle in her chest. The sky had taken on that same pale look it had before the third storm. The air grew still again, too still. One of the men noticed her glance upward. "You think it'll be worse?" She did not answer right away. She watched a thin line of cloud gather low over the hills. "I think," she said slowly, "we've not seen the worst yet." They parted ways as darkness fell, each returning to their homes with new boards nailed in place and tighter coverings secured over their firewood. There was gratitude in their nods now, but also worry. She walked back alone toward the edge of town. Her farmhouse looked small against the wide white fields. Smoke rose steady from her chimney, but the wind tugged at it harder than before. At her barn shelter, she paused. She ran her hand along the wooden door, feeling the solid brace beneath her palm. It had held through 3 storms already, but this next one felt different. Inside, she added another log to the stove and sat down by the window. The world outside blurred as snow began again, soft at first. In town, men and women checked their reinforced sheds and stacked wood a little tighter. They listened for the ring of dry logs and prayed it would last. Hours later, the wind returned with a force that rattled every house in the valley. Snow fell thick and fast, erasing the paths they had just cleared. Roof beams creaked, shutters slammed. She rose from her chair and stepped once more to the barn shelter door. The storm roared around her, louder than before. And as she reached for the handle, she felt something shift beneath the roof above, a low groan that did not sound like the others. The sound came again, deeper this time, a slow wooden complaint beneath the weight of fresh snow. She kept her hand on the barn shelter handle and tilted her head, listening past the roar of the wind. The roof had carried heavy loads before, but this was different. The storm had settled straight down without drifting off the slope. The cold that followed each snowfall had turned the lower layers to ice. She opened the door just a crack and peered inside. The firewood still looked dry, stacked tight and steady, but the air felt heavier. Snow had begun to pack along the edge of the roofline where the overhang met the wall. If that ridge hardened into ice, the next layer might not slide free. She closed the door gently and stepped back. The wind bit at her cheeks. For the first time since she had raised the structure, doubt brushed against her confidence. Inside the house, the stove burned steady, but the flames leaned toward the draft as the wind forced air through every small seam in the walls. She added 2 more logs, then sat down again, listening. Across town, others were listening too. In one farmhouse near the creek, a young couple took turns feeding a stubborn fire. Their wood had seemed dry enough after the repairs that afternoon, but as the temperature dropped, the logs began to hiss at the edges. Dampness trapped deep inside was fighting the flame. Smoke curled into the room before finding its way up the chimney. They opened a window a crack despite the cold, worried about the air growing thick. At the old mill house, a family gathered in one room to conserve heat. Their reinforced woodpiles stood behind the shed, braced the way she had shown them. Still, every loud gust made them glance toward the back door, wondering if the boards would hold. Back at her place, she rose again and pulled on her heavy coat. The groan under the roof returned, followed by a soft thud as something shifted. She stepped outside with a small shovel in hand. The storm swallowed her figure almost at once. Snow blew sideways, stinging her eyes. She moved carefully along the side of the house until she reached the barn shelter. The roofline was buried under a thick layer that had not slid off. The weight pressed down unevenly, especially near the corner where 2 older boards met. She set the shovel against the drift and began to clear along the lower edge, trying to ease the pressure without disturbing the structure too much. Each scoop felt heavier than the last. Her breath came short in the freezing air. Halfway through the task, a lantern glow flickered in the distance. Someone was coming up the path. It was the tallest man from earlier, shoulders hunched against the wind. He carried a rope over one arm. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he shouted over the storm. She did not stop shoveling. "It won't clear itself." He tied one end of the rope around a fence post and the other around his waist before stepping closer. Together they worked at the snow ridge, pushing it down in controlled slides. When a thick sheet finally broke loose and crashed to the ground, both of them paused, watching the roofline. The structure held. He let out a breath that almost looked like a laugh. "You built it stronger than we thought." She gave him a quick glance. "I built it to last." They continued clearing until the roof could shed the rest on its own. By the time they finished, her gloves were stiff with ice and his beard was white with frost. "Come inside," she said. "Warm up." He hesitated only a second before following her in. At the stove, he held his hands close to the flame, staring at the steady burn of dry oak. "Ours might not make it," he admitted quietly. "We stacked tight, like you said, but some of it was already damp." "You'll stretch what you can," she replied. "Small fires, keep doors closed. Share if you must." He nodded, though the idea of sharing wood in such weather carried its own weight. Firewood in a hard winter was more than comfort, it was survival. A loud crack echoed through town, distant but sharp enough to make them both look up. It could have been a tree limb snapping under ice or something else. He met her eyes. "If anyone needs help, we'll come back for you." "I'll be here," she said. When he left, the house felt quieter than before. The storm raged on, but now another thought pressed in. If this winter kept growing worse, even her carefully stacked firewood might not be enough. The wood was dry, yes, but it was not endless. She moved to the small cupboard near the door and took out her ledger. She had always kept careful track of her supplies. Flour, beans, salt, and wood. She ran a finger down the page where she had marked each armful brought inside since the first storm. Her stack could last weeks if used wisely. Less if others depended on it too. Outside, the wind shifted again, striking the house from a new angle. The barn shelter creaked but did not groan this time. Clearing the ridge had helped. Still, she knew the structure was being tested in ways she had not fully imagined. Toward midnight, another knock came at her door. This time it was not a group of men but a boy from town, barely tall enough to see over the snowbank. His face was pale with cold. "Our stove went out," he said. "Father's trying to relight it, but the wood won't catch." She did not ask questions. She took 2 dry logs from her shelter and wrapped them in burlap. The boy carried one, she carried the other. The walk back toward town felt longer than before. Snow rose nearly to her knees. The boy stumbled once, but she caught his arm before he fell. Inside his family's house, the air was sharp and thin. The father crouched by the stove, frustration etched across his face. When she handed him the dry oak, he did not speak, only placed it carefully over a bed of struggling coals. The difference was immediate. The flame caught clean and strong, spreading through the log without a hiss. Warmth began to push back the cold. He looked up at her, gratitude clear but mixed with something harder to name. "We'll repay you," he said. "Just keep it burning," she answered. As she stepped back into the storm, whispers followed her. Not mocking this time. Something closer to respect, though it carried a hint of worry too. If more families came knocking, how much could she give? By morning, the storm had not slowed. Drifts swallowed fence lines. The sky remained locked in a pale gray that offered no sign of clearing. At the general store, a few men gathered despite the weather. The roof there had been reinforced years ago, but snow pressed heavy against its beams. Inside, talk turned serious. "We should pool what dry wood we have," one suggested. "And when that runs out?" another replied. Silence answered him. The tallest man spoke up then. "Her shelter's still holding. She showed us how to brace ours. We need to finish the rest before night. But if this keeps up," someone else said, "even hers might fail." That thought lingered. Back at her farmhouse, she stood once more at the barn shelter door. She counted the rows with her eyes. She calculated how many logs remained in each stack. Another deep groan came from above, longer than before. She stepped back, scanning the roofline. Snow had begun to build again despite their efforts. The wind had shifted north, driving flakes under the overhang in a fine spray. She fetched the rope the tall man had brought and tied it around the far corner beam, anchoring it to a buried fence post. It would not stop a collapse if the boards split, but it might hold the pieces together long enough to clear them. As she tightened the knot, she heard shouting in the distance. 2 figures struggled through the drifts toward her place. Even from afar, she could see urgency in their movements. When they reached her yard, breathless and wide-eyed, one of them spoke. "The creek's rising under the ice," he said. "Water's backing up near the lower houses. If it breaks through, the sheds down there won't stand." She felt a cold that had nothing to do with the wind. Wet wood was one problem. Flooded wood was another entirely. "If their stacks get soaked," the second man added, "they'll have nothing." The storm howled around them, louder than ever. She looked from her barn shelter to the distant line of houses near the creek. Her own firewood was safe for now, but the town's supply was balanced on the edge of more than just snow. And as another heavy shift echoed through the boards above her head, she realized that this winter was not done testing any of them. The wind did not ease after the warning about the creek. If anything, it grew sharper, cutting across the fields and driving snow into every low place. The 2 men stood in her yard, shoulders hunched, waiting for her to say something. She looked past them toward the lower end of town where the land dipped. In spring, the creek ran gentle there, winding between willows and fence posts. In deep winter, it hid under a crust of ice that most folks trusted without thinking. But heavy snow and hard freeze could turn that quiet water into a force no one expected. "If the ice breaks," she said slowly, "the sheds closest to it will take the first hit." They nodded. "And most of their firewood is stacked outside," another nod. She tightened her shawl and made a decision that showed on her face before she spoke it. "We move what we can, now. The men glanced at her barn shelter, then back toward town. One of them hesitated. "Your wood," he said. "If this keeps building on the roof, it will hold a little longer," she replied, though the deep groan from the boards above them made that promise feel thin. They did not argue again. Word traveled fast even in a storm. By the time she reached the edge of town, a small group had gathered near the general store, faces pale with cold and worry. Snow had drifted high against the lower houses. Near the creek, the ground felt different underfoot, softer somehow, as if the weight of water pressed beneath the ice. The tallest man spoke over the wind. "We'll split into 2 groups. One clears paths. The other carries wood." She stepped forward. "Stack it high and tight inside the barns if you can. Keep it off the ground. Leave space near the back wall for air." They listened without question now. At the first house near the creek, water had begun to seep up through cracks in the frozen ground, turning snow to slush. The woodpile there sat only a few feet from the bank, covered in a canvas that was already sagging under wet snow. They worked fast, pulling logs from the stack and passing them hand to hand toward a nearby shed that sat slightly higher. Each piece of firewood mattered. Each dry log was a night of warmth saved. The woman who lived there stood by the door, wringing her hands. "We should have built it like hers," she said under her breath. "It's not too late to learn," the old woman answered, lifting another armful. A loud crack split the air, closer this time. Everyone froze. The ice along the creek shifted with a grinding sound that carried over the wind. Water surged up against the bank, dark and sudden. It did not break free yet, but it pressed hard, testing its hold. "Faster!" someone called. They moved until their arms shook. Snow fell thicker, blinding and relentless. The path they had cleared minutes before filled again. At the second house, the woodpile was already half soaked at the bottom. Meltwater from above had trickled down and frozen, trapping moisture inside the stack. She knelt and touched one of the lower logs. It felt heavy, wrong. "Leave the bottom row," she said. "Take what's dry." The man of the house looked torn. "That's half our supply. Half is better than none," she replied. He swallowed and nodded. As they carried the last of the dry logs uphill, another deep sound rolled through the valley. Not the sharp crack of ice this time, but a long, low rumble. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. Back at her farmhouse, her barn shelter stood alone against the storm. Snow had piled high along its north side again. The rope she had tied earlier strained tight against the buried fence post. The roof sagged a fraction more than before. No one was there to hear the small splitting sound near the back beam. In town, the work continued. Hands numb, backs aching, they formed a line between sheds and barns, moving firewood like it was gold. The old woman directed where to stack it inside, reminding them to lift it off the damp floor with scrap boards or rails. "Angle the top layer," she called. Let any melt run off. Even through the storm, people could see how calm she remained. That steadiness held them together. But fear traveled just beneath the surface. The boy who had come for help the night before tugged at his father's coat. "What about her wood?" he asked quietly. His father glanced toward the far edge of town where her chimney smoke was barely visible through the snow. "She said it would hold?" Another crash sounded from the creek. This time, a section of ice broke free with a heavy splash. Water rushed forward, spilling over the bank and racing toward the lowest sheds. A shout went up, "Back!" They stumbled away as dark water surged across the snow, carrying chunks of ice with it. One shed door burst open under the force, and a stack of firewood toppled into the rising slush. The sight hit them hard. Months of splitting, stacking, and covering undone in seconds. The old woman stepped closer than the others dared, studying the flow. The water spread wide but shallow, slowed by the heavy snow. If the ice upstream broke further, the surge would be worse. "We need a barrier," she said. "With what?" someone demanded over the wind. She scanned the area. Fence posts, broken boards, empty barrels half buried in drifts. Not much, but something. "Stack them along the bank," she ordered. "Anything solid. Slow the water." It was a desperate plan, but they had little choice. They dragged posts and boards into place, wedging them against the bank to create a rough wall. The work felt small against the force of the creek, yet it gave them purpose. As they labored, she felt a strange pull in her chest. Her mind drifted back to her own barn shelter. She pictured the roof under fresh weight, the back beam that had already begun to strain. She knew she should return to check it. Another rumble shook the ground. Upstream, more ice gave way. Water pushed harder against their makeshift barrier. Boards shifted. A barrel rolled loose before two men caught it and forced it back into place. "Hold it," someone yelled. The old woman braced a fence post with her own shoulder, boots sinking into slush. Cold water soaked through the hem of her skirt, biting at her legs. For a moment she felt the weight of years in her bones. The same strength that had built her woodshed now strained against a different force. Across town, a young woman looked toward the hill where the old farmhouse stood. She remembered the laughter on the store porch, the jokes about crooked boards and stubborn pride. Shame warmed her face despite the cold. "We should send someone to her place," she said. "Make sure her shelter's safe," but no one could spare the hands. The barrier along the creek shuddered again. Water sloshed over the top, spilling into the yard behind the lowest house. Firewood that had not yet been moved began to float and spin, bumping against the shed wall. A cry rose from the porch. The old woman pushed harder against the post. "Keep stacking," she urged. "Every inch helps." Snow continued to fall, but now it mixed with fine spray from the churning water. The world felt smaller, tighter, as if the storm and the creek together meant to squeeze the town from both sides. On the hill, the barn shelter gave another low groan. The sag at the roofline deepened slightly. A small crack ran along one board near the back corner, hidden beneath a ridge of snow. Inside the farmhouse, the stove burned bright and steady, unaware of the strain outside. Down by the creek, the barrier began to take shape. It was rough and uneven, but it slowed the rush just enough to keep the worst from flooding the sheds entirely. Water still pooled deep, but it did not sweep everything away. Breathless and soaked, the group stepped back to see if it would hold. For now, it did, but upstream the ice continued to shift. The tallest man wiped his brow with a shaking hand. "If that breaks all at once?" He did not finish the sentence. The old woman finally stepped away from the barrier. Her legs felt heavy from cold water. She looked toward her farmhouse again, barely visible through the storm. "I need to check my roof," she said quietly. No one tried to stop her this time. She began the slow climb back uphill, each step a fight against snow and wind. Behind her, the town held its breath, listening to the creek and the storm together. Halfway to her yard, a sharp cracking sound cut through the air, louder than any before. It did not come from the creek. It came from the hill ahead. The crack echoed again, sharp and final. She stopped in the middle of the path, heart pounding in a way it had not in years. The sound had come from her yard, from the direction of the barn shelter. For a moment the storm seemed to hush, as if even the wind waited to see what would happen next. Then another smaller snap followed, and she forced her legs to move. Snow dragged at her boots as she climbed. Her breath burned in her chest. When she reached the top of the hill, the sight before her made her stop cold. The back corner of the barn shelter roof had split where the older board met the newer beam. The sag she had noticed earlier had deepened. One side dipped lower than the other, and snow pressed heavy across the surface like a white hand refusing to lift. But it had not collapsed. The rope she had tied earlier held tight, keeping the corner from giving way completely. The roof was wounded, not broken. She moved forward slowly, studying the damage with careful eyes. If the rest of the beam failed, the weight would bring the whole structure down. And with it, the firewood that had carried her and now helped carry the town through the worst winter anyone could remember. Behind her, she heard boots crunching. The tallest man and two others had followed despite her earlier words. They reached her side and took in the sight without speaking. "Can it be saved?" one asked quietly. She stepped closer to the back wall and pressed her hand against the wood. The structure trembled faintly under the weight of snow, but it still felt solid beneath the split board. "It can," she said. "If we take the weight off and brace it." The men did not hesitate. They moved to the side of the shelter and began clearing snow from the roof again. this time working faster and more urgently than before. Each shovel of snow that slid off the slope felt like a small victory. The sag lessened bit by bit. She slipped inside the narrow space and pushed against the back beam, judging how much it had shifted. The air inside was cold but dry. The firewood stack remained tight and untouched. The careful stacking, the raised base, the angled roof, all the details she had been mocked for had done their job. "Hand me that board," she called. One of the men passed a thick plank through the doorway. She wedged it against the inside of the back wall, angling it upward to meet the weakened beam. It was not perfect carpentry, but it was enough to share the load. Outside, more snow slid free. With a final heavy push, the last ridge broke loose and crashed to the ground. The roof creaked once more, then settled into place. They all froze, listening. No further crack came. The storm still howled, but the barn shelter stood. A slow breath left her lungs. She had not realized she had been holding it. The tallest man wiped snow from his face and gave a short nod. "She's tougher than we thought." "She was built with patience," she answered, resting a hand against the wooden wall. They reinforced the back corner with another brace and tightened the rope before stepping back to look at their work. It was not pretty, but it was strong. From the hill, they could see the lower end of town where the creek had spilled over. The makeshift barrier still held, though water pooled deep behind it. Smoke rose from several chimneys, thin but steady. "We should check on the others," one of the men said. She looked at her barn shelter once more, then at the house where her stove burned bright. Her firewood was safe for now. The town's sheds were better than before, but not perfect. "I'll come," she said. Together they made their way downhill again. The storm had begun to ease, though snow still fell steady. At the creek, the water had slowed. The ice upstream had broken enough to release pressure, but not enough to send another surge. The barrier of posts and boards leaned crooked, yet it had done its work. The lowest sheds were wet at the edges, but most of the firewood they had moved earlier stayed dry inside barns and higher storage. The woman from the first house met them with tired eyes. "It's holding," she said. "The water's going down." Relief moved through their group like warmth. They spent the rest of the day checking each home. Where wood had gotten damp, they separated it from the dry stack, setting it near stoves to cure slowly. Where roofs had sagged, they added braces the way she had shown them. Everywhere she went, people listened more carefully than they ever had before. By nightfall, the storm finally began to break. The wind softened to a low hum. Snow drifted down in lighter flakes, no longer driven sideways. Exhausted, she walked back to her farmhouse under a sky that was clearing at the edges. The clouds parted just enough to reveal a thin strip of stars. She paused in front of the barn shelter once more. The roof, though scarred, stood firm, the braces held. She opened the door and stepped inside. The firewood remained dry, stacked as carefully as the day she placed each piece. She ran her hand across the top row, feeling the smooth bark beneath her fingers. For 2 years they had mocked this shelter. They had called it crooked, foolish, unnecessary. Yet through ice storms, record-breaking snowfall, flood risk, and the worst winter the valley had faced in decades, it had done exactly what it was built to do. It had kept the firewood dry. And because of that, it had helped keep a town warm. In the days that followed, the sky cleared fully. Sunlight hit the snowfields and made them shine bright as glass. The creek settled back into its frozen bed, quieter now. People came up the hill one by one, not with jokes this time, but with gratitude. Some brought small gifts, a jar of preserved apples, a sack of flour, a bundle of kindling split fine. The tallest man stood in her yard with his hat in hand. "We owe you," he said simply. She shook her head. "You owe yourselves." "You listened." He glanced at the barn shelter. "Would you help us rebuild ours in spring?" A small smile touched her face. "I will show you how," and she did. When the snow finally melted and the ground softened, the town gathered not at the general store porch but in her yard. Together they measured angles, raised bases, and set slanted roofs that would shed snow clean. They built wood sheds with proper airflow, tight stacking space, and strong braces at the corners. The laughter that drifted across the fields that spring sounded different. It carried no sharp edge, only shared effort. Children played near the creek again. Smoke rose steady from chimneys without fear of damp logs hissing in the stove. Her own barn shelter remained standing, weathered but proud. She never replaced the split board at the back corner. Instead, she left it as it was, a reminder of the night it nearly failed and the rope that held it fast. When the next winter came, it brought cold and snow as winters always do, but the town faced it differently. Wood was stacked tighter, roofs were angled better, firewood was kept dry. No one mocked simple ideas anymore. On quiet evenings, she would sit by her stove and listen to the steady crackle of oak. The sound meant warmth, safety, and foresight. It meant that patience and careful work mattered, even when others did not understand. Out beyond her window, rows of new woodsheds stood across the valley, each one built with lessons learned the hard way. The worst winter had tested more than timber and nails. It had tested pride, judgment, and community. In the end, it was not strength alone that carried them through, but humility and shared effort. Her barn shelter had begun as a lonely project, hammered together with scrapboards and stubborn will. It ended as proof that wisdom does not always shout. Sometimes it stands quiet against the wind, holding steady until others are ready to see it. And each time snow slid clean from her roof and landed soft at the base, she felt the simple satisfaction of knowing that dry firewood in steady hands had made all the difference.